Hey everybody, Mike Greb, lead analyst at One Touch Intelligence. This is OTIcast. We were lucky enough recently to catch up with Laura Martin. She's a senior media analyst at Needham Co, and she had a lot to say about the evolution of the media industry, the influence of AI, and even why the iPhone may want to watch its back. Let's check it out.
So this industry has gotten really crazy the last few years, as you know. What do you think if you look at media companies today, what do you see as the biggest threat and maybe the biggest opportunity that they have?
The biggest threat, I think, is whether this notion that we have that content is king is wrong. I think it might be that the tech stack is king or technology is king, as evidenced by internet distribution. So distribution is basically a tech backbone globally. And now we're getting generative AI. So the question is whether, again, tech is going to rush forward. And so whether tech is actually sort of the king of the land and content takes a backseat to that. I think that's the biggest question facing the industry today.
What do you think the answer is? What's your hunch?
I think it might be tech. I think content matters as a storytelling, but to the extent generative AI gets better and better, it's sort of mirroring emotions already. They're doing research showing that if someone's suicidal, it's better to allow an agentic AI to deal with that person. They commit suicide less than if there's a human being on the other end of the phone, which means we're getting to the point where they're so well trained on the right words and formulas, depending on the person's response, that the agentic AI comes back and says something more soothing that saves their life more often. So that's a high stakes situation. That implies that we're going to get to that point at storytelling eventually, which is a more complicated, long form version than just Q&A with someone on the phone.
So as AI video advances as it has been with VO3, is a lot of people out there, and you need to pay $250 a month to get it right now, but the stuff is getting pretty amazing. So do you see, are you thinking customized video that's going to understand people's emotions and actually be able to create the video and the content that fits them specifically?
Maybe, and I'm thinking 3 to 5 years. I am not thinking a year. I think this is the biggest question I think Wall Street is dealing with when we think about forward year cash flows. What's the interaction between content is king, which has been a long assumption as long as you and I have been in the business, is that changing? If not, no problem, then everything's valued properly. But if that's changing and it's moving to something else, we need to be careful because that means these stocks are overvalued.
Well, the content spending has been an interesting piece, right? Because everyone has generally brought it down a bit except for Netflix. Do you see that continuing, or is it leveling off and is there too much content?
Yes, we're at peak content. I would expect to see content come down. As an industry overall, I would expect to see content fall 5% a year, content spending, in part because we're getting more and more back office stuff done by generative AI tools or AI tools. So that will be spending as part of that, the back office, and the infrastructure is part of the spending budget.
So do you see through tools like AI the same amount of content just being made more cheaply, or is it literally less content being produced?
I think it might be more content made more cheaply, actually. Maybe not long form originally, maybe it's going to be 3 minutes, 5 minutes. But if you and I think that consumer time is what's valuable, then user-generated content has to enter into our conversation. And the minute you talk about that, a lot of these user-generated content people are one person. They're going to use generative AI really fast to improve, or increase their ability to come to market with new content. And those might be short form, but that then creates more competition for time against the let me call it the big studios in TV and film.
Do you see, speaking of the big studios and the big media companies, the traditional media companies, obviously it's been an interesting time with what NBCU and Warner Brothers Discovery is now doing, essentially creating separate companies for their cable business, putting a lot of debt on those companies. We could maybe assume that those companies start merging together or swapping assets at some point, and maybe Paramount and others get into this game. So where do you see this ending? And I know you wrote a note about this in respect to Warner Brothers Discovery, which was the most recent one, but where do you see that going?
So, I think Paramount, right now the administration wants a $30 million payment personally in order to have the FCC approve the deal. Meanwhile, it's subscale, and we just got this tragic news that Sherry Redstone has cancer. So distracting, not really a competitor, and some scale. Now we have Warner Brothers, who's going to split its $24 billion market cap into two $12 billion market cap companies, which again, subscale and distracting, because you're focused on, the senior management's now focused on financial engineering, And to maintain the tax advantage, they can't merge with anybody for 2 years in a business where they're subscale. So none of that is good for shareholders in my point of view. So that means who's left? So who's competing in streaming? It's Disney at around numbers $300 billion market cap, Netflix at $500 billion market caps, Amazon and Google, YouTube. I would say Apple's not a competitor. So really, we're talking, streaming is now going to be defined by these really big boys, and we're going to be asking the question, is Disney too small? Is Disney subscale? And should they be bought? And we've been saying Apple should buy Disney for 5 years now. We've been, Apple hasn't listened to us on this, but it turns out that Apple doesn't listen to most people on anything. So we're in good company. So I would say streaming is getting to be a smaller. Now, if we want to open it up to the platforms like Samsung, LG, Roku, which sort of aggregate these long tail programmers that are at Stream TV this conference, then we can start talking about bigger. But really, from a point of view of long form TV and film production, it's the 4 I just mentioned.
Well, you mentioned this, but because the Silicon Valley companies are generally so much bigger, I mean, by far, than the sort of traditional studios. And you mentioned, is there more M&A around that? But I mean, do they just have to all basically merge into one big studio just to take on Netflix, Amazon? And
yeah, they do.
much?
And the film business doesn't really return its cost of capital. So you better have a sister subsidiary that in the 2 bad years where you have a $200 million, I don't know if you remember the Disney year where they had two $200 million films that crashed. I mean, basically, like the studio had to go to its sister, like the theme parks, and say, can we have some money, please? Because otherwise they would have put the company out of business.
Right, and if you put all your free cash flow in a separate
Yeah.
company,
It's problematic.
you don't have that to fall back on anymore.
It's
right?
problematic. Yeah.
Yeah.
And we saw that with DreamWorks. Remember there was DreamWorks Animation and DreamWorks Live Action, and they did Blue Lagoon and one other bad film, and they actually went bankrupt because they didn't have a sister subsidiary to fund them through the bad times.
Well, then what would your advice have been to, say, in this case, we're just talking about NBCU and Warner Brothers Discovery, which have done this. What would have been your advice rather than create a separate company for the cable assets?
Well, I mean, I think Warner Brothers, I would have suggested, needed to get bigger, not smaller. I think this is the wrong direction. In terms of Comcast, it has plenty of other assets to fund its film business if it has a couple bad years, because they have parks. The minute you have parks, it's just sort of like an annuity stream. And I sort of believe that the future of media is in proprietary data. And I think parks data, I think people underestimate how valuable real life data is. Not only for consumer products, but for visitations, for purchasing. There's a lot of data from the real world that when you overlay it with, let's call it virtual data, where there are a lot of competitors, that data is best in class. So I think Disney and Comcast both have those kind of unique data advantages. And as we know, the large language models are running out of data. So my opinion is these companies that have data access that's unique are going to be able to sell that data stream to the large language models as a new revenue stream that nobody has in our estimates.
So is that the primary benefit, or is it more that they can then merge that data with what they have on viewing data through their streaming services and correlate?
And target
how
people
do you
better.
Correlate? I guess you have the identity of the people at the
Yeah,
parks.
sure you do. It's all
Also watching
permissioned.
Disney Plus.
You sure do.
Right.
Yeah, and you're basically, somebody in the parks is a very wealthy individual, because as we know, it's like $1,000 to send 4 people to the Walt Disney Company or over to the Universal Epic, the new Epic theme park. So you really want to be targeting those people with concert tickets and any sort of thing in live. It tells you they're willing to move people through space and spend a lot of money for live. So anything that can tie to commerce or spending is really valuable data. And the large language models are going to need that kind of data over time. So I think that's a new revenue stream for companies that have proprietary permissioned first-party data. And of course, they can use it themselves, of course. But to me, that's a small idea versus selling it to a large language model.
Do you think this might be why Netflix is doing these mall pop-ups that they're going to create? So this is sort of the connection.
It's like a new revenue stream connected with an asset they're making in the virtual world. I absolutely think you need to have real life. I think that's a competitive advantage to have an omni-channel data flow across your fandom. And part of it, like WWE, remember they had all of those fans that would save up a year to go to World Wrestling, the wrestling annual meeting. You want to have that if you're Netflix too, for fans of Stranger Things, or it's just another way to pull capital and pull spending out of your fandom.
What do you think of their strategy though versus having one big park that everyone has to go to, or 2 big parks, or 4 around the world, versus their strategy of having these smaller experiences that are in various cities and that sort of thing. It's a different sort of strategy.
Definitely. I think it's smart to see if it works. I think it's an experimental phase, and Netflix isn't that big in the scheme of life. So they should try this and see what works and iterate. And over time, I mean, to create a Netflix park, I mean, it'd be a $10 billion asset. It'd be a big bet.
Mm-hmm. On the front, what we were talking about earlier about possible M&A between the traditional studios, is it also possible that instead of that they just do more partnerships and work more closely together with the bundling and other things that have happened, or does it have to be a financial union for it to work?
I definitely like the bundling idea. I think bundling lowers churn and increases lifetime value. I think you get into regulatory issues and you get into data sharing issues, right? Like, has the consumer really given you permission to share with your partners? Do you all really have the same interests in mind? If streaming is if it's core for Netflix, but it's an afterthought for Disney, do they want the same bundle, or Roku, like even sort of worse? So I think the issue with bundling across third parties is A, there's not as much of a cost cutting. B, you can't really market it together because they have different necessarily. So we have seen bundling work more effectively, like within the Disney empire. Hulu plus ESPN plus Disney plus kids sports, let me call it live action. That's the best kind of bundle because you can price it anywhere you want. You can make Christmas specific marketing. So controlling everything is typically a bundling experience. If you don't have those assets, is it really worth it to buy it versus bundle? You should absolutely try doing it with third parties.
Is it a bad idea, some of the cases that have already happened with competitors bundling with each other? Do you think that's
smart.
a bad idea?
Bundling is a smart idea. It's just slow, and you just don't have as much control.
Is it the best strategy for someone like an AMC Plus or a Stars that can fill a niche somebody else doesn't have? I mean, is that kind of the best way for them to...
So if you bundle up niche services, it lowers churn. So anything that lowers churn increases lifetime value,
I guess my final question would just be, if you look 3 to 5 years out, you mentioned that earlier, can we even predict what's going to happen, because things are changing, especially on the AI side, so quickly? But what do you think is going to be the biggest thing that maybe surprises people about how things shake out with these big media companies?
So, I think what I'm most excited about when I think of a 5-year frame is what's happening today in 2025 is that Amazon is spending $105 billion building its large language models and generative AI backbone capability around its cloud business called AWS. Google, YouTube, Gemini, which is its large language model, spending 85. I think Microsoft is at 80, and Meta, which is Facebook, is at 65 billion. That's what they'll spend. So $313 billion this year on generative AI backbone. Next year, I'm going to say the same. So we're going to spend $1 trillion in America on something that basically sets up a backbone layer, because none of this is consumer facing, it is enterprise facing. And then what happens next, let's say a year from now, is that kids start dropping out of Harvard and creating the next Google search or Facebook or TikTok. And I don't think it will be apps. And most exciting, and the Apple iPhone is in threat of being replaced because Apple charges a 30% of revenue share on its device. So every other competitor wants that revenue stream, and they want to displace the smartphone. So Meta and Google have said, we think it's glasses. We think you're going to talk to your glasses, but that means we're no more apps. We're not doing apps anymore. The guy that designed every Apple product you own, his name is Sir Johnny Ive, has said, I want to move away from screens. There were unintended consequences.
By OpenAI, right?
Yep, he's now in partnership with Sam Altman of OpenAI, which is a large language model. And he says, I want to move people away from screens. So I'm going to try to displace Apple's smartphone with a device that's so smart and generative AI native and doesn't have a screen. Okay, now that is interesting. What does that mean? So what happens next is, after we have this backbone layer, all of that backbone will charge 10%, in my opinion, of anybody that drops out of Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Stanford, creates a some app that's either in glasses or on this thing without a screen and is in a cloud somewhere. And that layer of consumer-facing software pays 10% to one of these big laptops, and we completely retool the American economy. We basically put search out of business, Google search out of business, which is already happening. We put Meta out of business. We all get a whole new layer in 5 years of how we go through the world, and it will be more efficient, and it will be 30% lower costs. And then we take over the world because Europe is not allowing LLMs to come into Europe. So we're
What about China, though?
Maybe, but unfortunately, trust is a big deal when you're giving data to large language models. So today, America is 5% of the global population and 25% of GDP. I think post-generative AI revolution, we'll be 5% of the world's population and 30% of GDP at a lower cost. Because GDP is a revenue measure, at a lower cost, so higher returns on capital. I'm so excited about what comes next.
So a good time maybe to be in the stock market.
Well, we'll see.
Over the next 5 years.
Yeah, we'll see. Some of the stuff hasn't been invented. So I'm really excited about that.
Well, you've sufficiently blown my mind, Laura, which was expected. So I appreciate it. But thanks for being with us today.
My pleasure. Have a great day. Thanks,
You too.
Mike. Take care. Bye.